Good morning and welcome to today's installment of the Winter Cape Perpetua series. We're going to be hearing from Cami Ellingson. She's going to be sharing her presentation on valuing water and learning from the past to add resilience to our future. And next week's presentation on January 30th will be about the Amanda Trail, history, significance, and bridging gaps with Joanne Cattell. My name is Tara DuBois. I'm the communications coordinator for the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. It's an honor to organize this series. And our vision, the collaborative's vision, is to foster communication and collaboration within local communities for scientific management, awareness, and stewardship from the land to the sea around the Cape Perpetua area. And our three guiding principles are community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And we have a variety of founding partners, as you can see here at the bottom. We have some federal agencies, state agencies, some local nonprofits, as well as the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. Our focus is around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve, which is the biggest marine reserve out of 5 in Oregon. And in addition, with our marine protected areas, there will be protected waters stretched from Yachats to Florence. And I always like to share a fun fact, and today's fun fact is that the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the management and scientific monitoring agency of Oregon's marine reserves, and they capture some really great footage of what's happening below the water. And so there are a series of really short video clips that you can view and watch and see some different critters on our website at capeperpetuacollaborative.org on the Marine Reserve tab, or you can also find them by just doing a Google search for Oregon Marine Reserves Flickr and check out all their great photos and videos. The Cape Perpetua Collaborative also hosts a variety of community science projects in the area. Some of them are seasonal, some of them are monthly, and you can also find those on our website, as well as this speaker series lineup. And we also host a Young Scientist webinar series on the second Tuesday, October through April, which highlights young scientist grad students doing research around the ocean. I highly encourage you to check us out and connect with us on our Facebook page, as well as our YouTube channel, which is where we host all of our recordings from all of our speaker series presentations and events. So if you missed one, you can go back and watch it. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Cami Ellingson. She's a hydrologist with over 20 years of field experience, ranging from landslide studies following the 1996 storm event in Western Oregon to road, stream, and estuary restoration. Cami has led the restoration of Salmon River Estuary since 2007 and has been recognized nationally and internationally for the success of physical restoration and collaboration partnerships. Cami received both her bachelor's degree in natural resources management and her master's in forest engineering hydrology from Oregon State University. And with that, Cami, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to you. As Cami brings up her presentation, I just want to let you guys know that we will be doing Q&A at the end. So feel free to add your questions as they come up through the presentation to the Q&A section. And we will address those at the end of the presentation. Cami, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Tara. All right, happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to focus a bit on beavers this morning and water. So this photo is a photo that Duncan Berry took. It's a tributary to Crowley Creek, which is in the Salmon River Estuary area. And we don't know as much as we would like about beavers in the estuary, but I thought the photo was just beautiful, and it shows the elk in the background. And we do know that in the winter, when the flood flows and the tide flows really start chasing the beavers out of the low estuary, that they move up into these tributaries. I'm not, oh, there we go. So I think it's important to provide some context. So in the face of a changing climate, we have conditions out there currently that are also changed. We had splash dams in Western Oregon for over 70 years, functioning to transport timber downstream to mills. So from 1880 to roughly 1950, there were considerable changes that took place in our stream systems. We've also drained and ditched our depositional valleys and wetlands to get water out faster and facilitate just different management practices and development. We've dammed and dredged our tidal systems to facilitate, again, roads and development, and we've removed beavers. Here's a map. This was completed by Miller in 2010, and it's pulled from a publication called The Stream Remembers. And I just want to emphasize that the stream truly does remember. These splash dams were significant and had significant impacts up and down the coast by altering the geomorphology and changing the system from maybe a very sinuous and dynamic system, very connected to its floodplain, to one deeply incised or even scoured all the way down to bedrock for miles. Before I get too much into what I think beavers provide these systems and what we know from science in regard to what beavers can provide, I just want to talk a bit about hydrology and explain the differences in the hydrology in different locations within a watershed. Starting with these upper systems, material is transported. These are steep headwater streams, tributaries to these larger, more low gradient stream systems. And in these low gradient stream systems, historically, prior to European settlement, we would have had really anabranching systems, very shallow channels, many channels across these depositional valleys, carrying the material from the headwaters down and depositing it all through these low gradient valleys. And here I just want to give some examples. These are 3 examples of beavers watched in systems, both in terms of benefits, but also negative impacts of the removing of beavers. In this first example, researchers estimate, this is in the upper Mississippi and Missouri River basins, they estimate that beaver ponds covered 51 million acres. And then with the reduction of beavers and the removal of beavers, the surface water stored and the wetlands and groundwater recharge caused huge loss, not just during summer low flow and drought conditions, but also in terms of flood attenuation and water storage. Elk Island Park in East Central Alberta, Canada. This is just a document of change over time from 1948 to 2002. The beaver dam building and maintenance made the area much less sensitive to drought and helped decrease downstream flood peaks during the river's rapid access to the floodplain during high flows. So when a system's really connected to that floodplain, the floodplain can do what it's intended to do, which is just capture all that stormwater and give it a place to go and reduce impacts elsewhere. In Crane Creek, Oregon, I think this is my favorite example. From in 1924, there were beavers present in Crane Creek. The meadows had high water table, which supported these native grasses. The grasses were sub-irrigated by these beaver ponds. The beavers were trapped out in 1924. The channel began to incise, and by 1935, the channel had deepened 25 feet. In 1936, the beavers were reintroduced, and by 1938, just a couple years later, the water table had risen and the hay meadow production had improved. In 1939, it was a drought year, yet the water was abundant on the ranch with beaver ponds, while absent downstream on ranches without beaver ponds. And this was all provided by Suzanne Foudy's research in 2008. So for hundreds of years, we have actively converted depositional stream reaches to transport stream reaches by ditching, diking. In 1850, with the passage of the U.S. Swampland Act, folks were encouraged to do that very thing, just increase the efficiency of water routing and get the water out of the way so that agricultural practices and other uses, land uses, could be supported. And I want to call your attention to the photo on the right of your screen. This is in Idaho, actually, and what they're calling, they called attention to this in a paper that I was reading, that they improved this reach, and the improved reach is the area in red. And a lot of the restoration work that the Sisal National Forest is involved with now is creating essentially what this system was. This is Camas Creek in Idaho. And this green lush area that's very sinuous and really connected to its floodplain is actually the aquatic restoration program that I'm very involved with. That's the end goal. And it's funny, this is a 1968 photo of an improved Camas Creek by essentially increasing that efficiency and ditching it, and it's deepened and resulted in considerable changes in the hydrology. So getting to what I was alluding to in that previous picture, it's now generally accepted that river engineering and management that works with the natural processes rather than against them is likely to sustain the multifunctional goals. And prior to European colonization, beaver populations were estimated to 60 to 400 million across North America. Beaver were intensively trapped out for their pelts through the 1800s and eradicated from developed areas where they were often considered a nuisance. And still, of course, in the beaver state, they have a nuisance status and a predatory status of trees. So as long as that status for beavers is sustained, the uncertainty about beaver populations just continues. So I want to emphasize the benefits. This was pulled from a David Bailey paper. David Bailey and Ben Dittbrenner have been doing work in Western Washington, and primarily with nuisance beavers on private property that they're moving to locations where on tribal lands or on public lands where these benefits are sought after. And often we pay millions of dollars and secure grant funding to essentially try to create these components and bring these components back to these systems. So you can read these, I hope, but I can read a few of these off and just emphasize the significance of what beavers can do if allowed to persist in the system, and if the hydrology supports them as well. And given all the changes we've already that have already resulted from our past, there's a lot of work ahead of beavers to sustain and to be allowed to sustain in these depositional valleys where they once were abundant. So wetland and floodplain connectivity, reestablishing historic floodplains and increasing the wetland habitat area, water storage, pools and side channels, increased catchment storage, which raises the water table and supports, essentially an oasis of diversity in both plants and animals and insects and amphibians. Nutrient cycling, these created pools increase nitrogen, phosphate, carbon, and other micronutrient availability. With regard to sediment transport, there's increased sediment accumulation behind beaver dams that can often improve sediment systems and improve subsurface flow and connection, high sediment systems, so preventing sediment from transporting downstream and really allowing it to filter and hold within these low gradient valleys. Water quality, this has been studied, decreases in water temperature downstream and increases in dissolved oxygen, improving the outflowing water for fish and micro and macro invertebrates. Stream complexity, creating the step pool sequences and habitat diversity that increases hydrological pathways. In the face of climate change and droughts, this increased water storage and carbon collection addresses catchment and climate change adaptation goals. The riparian vegetation structure and buffer zones, There's, you know, often frustration with beavers removing trees. They definitely are both engineers, hydrologists, and I guess I would add silviculturists, because they do often remove even large conifers because they want those deciduous trees to really flush in an area and fill in. So we've had beavers move into our project sites. We're always happy when they do, but you do have to welcome, you know, the changes that come in both the vegetation, the water, and everything else in relation. So I just wanted to show this. I'm often told that we just don't know enough. You know, we just don't know enough about beavers. And in Oregon, we really don't know much about the populations. We do know a fair amount, and the science is increasing on the benefits. And you can see the bottom table is the number of publications about beavers since 1900. And you can look at the increase. I think at this point there's over 13,000 peer-reviewed research articles about beavers. I brought this top graph. I made it a bit larger so that you could see the publications as indicated by keyword. So I know for us in the Coast Range, with Oregon Coastal Coho being listed, the primary limiting factor is the winter rearing habitat, which of course is what beavers would be providing if they were sustaining in these low depositional valleys and building these complexes of beaver dams. That is the very habitat that the Oregon Coast Coho is limited on, as it is working to recover, or as we're working to recover coho. And in the face of changing conditions, you know, we live in the Coast Range of Oregon, which is seeing a fair amount of change that isn't even included or you know, predicted within the climate change models. For instance, with fog, there's a big question about fog related to climate change going forward and increased warming. Will we see increased warming all the way to the coastline? Will that push the marine layer off for longer periods of time? I already feel folks have commented to me that the fog duration and the number of days with fog and how long it stays in any given day is seeming to have decreased. We don't really know, and there's no predictions on this, but if that fog band and if that marine layer is affected, it'll have a significant impact on our vegetation types, our sitka spruce, our water temperatures. A lot of times our water temperatures are kept in check by the summer fogs. It prevents our stream temperatures from reaching those 7-day maximum toxic temperature levels for salmon. And then just thinking about the flood flows and the drought conditions, those are also factors that when you look at the climate models, it makes the Coast Range look like we really don't have anything to worry about. But I'm afraid that we do, because of the geology. We don't have much groundwater storage in Thai sandstone geology. We don't have fractured basalt pockets of cold water in the Coast Range. We get what we get, and we get it when we get it. So if we're going to go longer periods without rain, what's that going to mean? If we're going to have all of our rain in a 4-month period instead of an 8-month period, what does that mean? Are we going to see more fire? Are we going to have increased stream temperatures? Are we going to have less fog? And are we going to have more drying? And so just thinking about all of those factors certainly leads me back to how beaver wetland complexes and just wetland restoration and tidal restoration in general, thinking through these processes and trying to restore these processes will add resilience to our future going forward. This is in December of 2015. In Tillamook County, there were a total of 29 inches of rain, and all of the precipitation, of course, fell as rain. And with 2 days with, let's see, I think the date got cut off, but there were 2 days where in one day we had over 4.5 inches of total rainfall. This is a picture of the Salmon River estuary doing exactly what an estuary should do, hold that tidal water and allow that mixing and flood pressure to be relieved out onto these restored tidal marshes. This is a couple of images in a sequence of Highway 101 across the estuary and a new culvert that was put in to facilitate the passage of Fraser Creek, which had been ditched on the east side of 101. And you can just see the tidal sheet flow. This is a small tidal event with a large rainfall event, but when we have the two together, we definitely see that increased flood pressure. And in the name of future resilience, the restoration program that the Saisla National Forest is partnering with many key folks to implement is working to restore these processes, get the streams up out of these fire hose systems where they've become deep and incised, and they scour down to bedrock, and that water has nowhere to go but maybe faster and digging in the soft, tidy sandstone, but getting it up onto these floodplains. This is Bessie Creek. This is a tributary to the North Fork Saisla. This is a project to restore some connectivity to the floodplain. And why do we care? Why do we care about that? We care because we may see our intensity of storms increase for these shorter duration periods of time, and the water has to go somewhere. So I know for as long as the Salmon River estuary was diked, and for as long as 5 Mile and Bell Creeks were ditched, when the flood flows hit those areas, there isn't an off channel essentially for those high velocity flows and those high volumes of water. There's no real place for it to go to reduce the impacts of the flooding downstream. And in the summertime, if our channels are deepened and overly deepened with these high banks, not like this image shows, that's what we want. But in many places, for instance, on that Bessie McLeod Creek project, that stream channel at North Fork Saisla River was down 22 feet from the top of the stream bank down to the water surface, which, by the way, was already scoured all the way down to bedrock. It didn't have anywhere else it could go to relieve some of that velocity and that pressure from the volumes of flow. But if these channels are more sinuous and they're shallow and they're regularly connected to that floodplain, that elevates the water table through times of drought, supports vegetation, and groundwater recharge. This is an image in Utah, I believe. And this is that oasis I was talking about. It's a lot more dramatic of a visual on the east side or in more arid states. But I wanted to just help you folks visualize what these wetland complexes can look like, and essentially the diversity of life that a system like that would support. And again, another why does it matter? We're doing a climate vulnerability assessment on the Saisla right now, and municipal water demands are the dominant freshwater use of water coming off of the national forest lands in the Coast Range. National forest land makes up 20% of the land base, but provides 40% of the municipal water. So if our conditions are shifting and we're seeing less rainfall, or maybe we see more rainfall, but it's in a really intensified period of time, and we go longer stretches of the calendar year without as much rainfall, these folks are going to care. All the folks that rely on the drinking water from the federal lands are going to notice. So in terms of our restoration projects and in terms of beavers moving back in, I can't think of a site where we've implemented a large-scale process-based restoration where the beavers haven't moved back in. And I find it really interesting that the hydrologic changes have been significant enough in some areas to really prevent beavers from being able to get a foothold, especially in flashy hydrology of the Coast Range. But where they do, they essentially do the work for us. They move in and create the kind of habitat that we want for our salmon, our salmon habitat for the rearing young rearing fish is just increased by magnitudes, where we have beavers moving in. This Bell Creek and 5 Mile Creeks, the beavers have moved into the lower portions that we implemented in early phases. Pretty much the first year. At Karnowski Creek, they moved in within 2 years and established about 27 beaver dams. And Salmon River Estuary, they're giving it a try as well, although often up higher on some of the tributaries. And I think, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but that was where I wanted to open it up to questions, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tammy. We do have a couple questions come in, and to those who are here, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A. I always like to start out with a question. I'm always curious on kind of what was your inspiration or your aha moment, or, you know, kind of what made you go into this field?
Oh, into hydrology. Okay, I can tell you exactly. I was in the Tillamook area climbing landslides after the 96 storm. I was up Wilson Creek actually, and there was a huge flood flow in Wilson Creek that resulted in the water moving boulders the size of cars, and it had ramped the flow of this just churning mass of logs and boulders had left a scour mark on the hillside. And standing down in the stream system in the summertime, of course, that's when it's safe to go out in the field and assess the impacts of this landslide. I was in awe of the magnitude of that flood flow, and the scour line on the hillside was probably 60 feet up the side channel. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, if I could have just been from a safe distance somewhere, just kind of watching that, and the power of that was so impressive. So that was the moment that I was doing field work for Oregon State University and the Department of Forestry, doing the landslide studies, and I thought, I want to go back to school in hydrology. I want to know more about this. Excuse me.
It's always amazing how sometimes that one experience can really shape, you know, things. All right, so I'm going to dive into the participant questions now. This one is, when I planted native trees and shrubs on a riparian bank that was in bad shape, the beavers started cutting them down. I had to protect the vegetation with wire fencing. Does beaver action naturally lead to bank erosion?
Oh, good question. Well, I would say no, because the vegetation recovery, you're right to fence out young plantings. You have to, and you have to give your plantings and your efforts a head start. But the vegetation and even the studies that I've been reading recently are indicating that the vegetative recovery is far greater than the negative impact. They do often have their travel routes and their ramps and their common kind of access points to the water, and those do tend to be, you know, bare. But the way that they cut willow down, and the way that they store willow and eat willow, and other, you know, species for that matter that are deciduous and woody shrub material like that, it encourages the root growth and the root response. So usually you get more in return growing back from the clippings that they take. But you're certainly right that when you're trying to get young plantings established in a bare place where there's very little food for them to choose from, that's a tricky endeavor, and you definitely have to fence out sections so that you can get what you're trying to get established to take hold. Also, there's studies showing that some of the dormant seed in the soils are brought to light because the way beavers build their dams, they take this muck and mud down at the bottom of the stream channels, and they use it like glue and plaster it all over the woody material in the dam. And when those dormant seeds are brought to light on the dam surface itself, they grow and sprout. And so some of these long dormant seed sources are exposed and uncovered, and and take hold. So that's been really cool to see some of the research out of Western Washington on that.
Nice. Can you please define Splashdam?
Oh, sure. You know, in one of my other presentations, I have pictures of splash dams, but I didn't know how much detail I should go into for this talk, just given the 20-minute time constraint. But they were dams that were constructed that were full spanning. They would block the river system and cut all the trees up above on the hillside and fill the pond back behind the dam with the down trees and logs. And then they would do log drives where they would either blow up the dams with dynamite, or they would have these they would have these dam openings where they could open it up and then just run all of the logs down to the mills and lower down in the system. And you can imagine what that does to a stream channel. We need all this gravel, and that provides all this wonderful, cool subsurface water and interconnection with the stream water. And without that, and it's scoured down to bedrock, you don't get those benefits. Neither do the fish. And from a habitat complexity standpoint, there's a lot lost as a result of splash damming. And granted, it went on, many years ago, but we still see the impacts of that in these stream systems, systems that are just devoid of the kind of complexity that they would have had we not implemented that practice. So.
Mm-hmm. How does an elevated water table behave during seismic activity, for example, tsunami or Cascadia subduction zone event?
Oh, that's a great question and a fascinating question to me. It would certainly depend on the soil structure and the soil type. I took a considerable amount of soil physics in my graduate program, and I remember doing some work with sand and soil physics, and it's so interesting because sand is perfectly round, and you add water and you add shaking, and you sink. It's quicksand. So the more sand in your soil, the more impact you would have by just adding water. But even doing the landslide study that I was involved with, the main factor that we were witnessing was that liquefaction component, where you add water to these high clay or high porosity soils, and you just end up with it liquefying and moving down off the site. And essentially, once it leaves that origination point, it's snowballing and collecting kind of more and more mass as it moves down and torrents down onto the low depositional valleys. So yes, I guess I can see where the question is coming from, given what is going to happen at some point with the large subduction zone quake that we expect. And you can see even in the Salmon River estuary with the coring and the carbon dating, the elevations of the marshes and the reset of those marshes. With the big 1700 quake, you can find that elevation as you core down. It's like a timetable or a timeline. You can find the other marsh elevations from past earthquake and large events. So it's inevitable and it's going to happen. It happens regardless of whether the water table is elevated at the time of the quake or not. And I don't know what more to say necessarily about that, but
yeah, kind of a wait and see.
yeah.
How is it going working with landowners to reintroduce beavers, and what are their typical objections?
That's a good question. My experience with relocation of beavers, the successful stories that I have to share are in Western Washington, and with University of Washington and with Tulalip tribes. And so in those cases, the beaver were either upstream of a county culvert with a large, very ambitious dam, and worry from the county public works folks that the dam was going to fail and cause harm to the lower culvert. So the situations up there are often that the beavers are moved from a site like that to either public land or to tribal land. The landowners, of course, in those cases are, supportive, and they want the benefits of the beavers there. As I mentioned, we're often paying millions of dollars to try to get and try to generate the same benefits that we could get by just, a colony of beavers creating a network of these dams and wetland complexes. So it's a very desired outcome in the locations where we've been moving them. And the reasons for moving them are numerous, although there are so many practices, inexpensive practices that can be implemented to keep beavers where they are. And I have found that moving beavers isn't as successful as the landowner who's having the problem wants it to be, because the conditions are ripe in that location for beavers to move in from somewhere else or disperse and become a problem again. And sometimes it's kind of like better to work with what you know than what you don't know. So if you have a colony of beaver on your property and it's doing something you don't want, rather than just think about moving it, it would be perhaps in your best interest to try to work with them and find compromise. There are a number of different things, even pond level elevation devices that can keep the flooding to a certain extent. There's painting trees with a non-toxic paint that has sand in it. Beavers don't like the grit of what would be, they don't like the feeling of that in their teeth, and they won't chew on those trees. The fencing works. There's deceivers of various kinds to prevent them from constructing on culverts. There's just a number of ways to work with them, and in my opinion, especially given what's uncertain about our future, the benefits far outweigh the negative impacts, especially if they're manageable ones.
Mm-hmm. How do fish populate the streams that are crossed by beaver dams?
Very successfully. They salmon and various fish evolved with beavers. Beavers were everywhere before we really started tinkering in these systems, and salmon thrived. The populations were. It'd be mind-boggling to folks today to think about how many salmon were in these systems at the time when there were just maybe as many beavers. And so the adults get over the beaver dams no problem. The young rearing fish love the benefits and thrive and grow at high growth rates and stay for long periods in these black water habitats, especially just specifically speaking to coho. They're not very good swimmers. They need to get out of the high velocity flows. And we've created these systems in these depositional valleys where all they have are high velocity flows. And they don't have places where they can get off and rest and eat and grow. And again, that limiting factor being winter rearing habitat, that's the very thing that these beavers are, they're pros at generating if given a chance.
And then this one says, we have been watching the erosion after wildfires on Kimball and Echo Mountains. Channels are being created as well. What changes should we expect with the Salmon River?
Yeah, well, all that transport, those are those classic transport reaches, these headwater stream systems moving down onto the flats, and that'll come down into these areas and deposit. It's why these low flat areas have such a rich soil. We're talking years and years. This is the process by which these elevations are created and kept in check, and these processes are just natural processes. The fire itself and the intensity of the burn, I've looked at it. I find these fires that we had in 2020 really interesting because they burned at such a high intensity, and primarily, if you even look up the McKinsey and you look up Santiam areas, they burned private land. And even at Echo Mountain, it burned on the private land and stopped pretty much right at the Forest Service boundary where a thinning had been implemented, which I find really interesting as well. And I think that these plantations of the same age of trees, all the same age, all the same species, we're finding that they burned really hot, and maybe the intensity or the extent of those burns may be different, and then the erosion that would be coming off of those areas, or how those areas would recover, may be exacerbated essentially by just the intensity of that burn. But I don't know that yet. And again, as far as sediments moving down into these systems, that's how this happens. There's a LiDAR imagery of this area and all the old earth flows and landslides, and this has been happening for far before us. So it'll continue to happen. But have we exacerbated some of the conditions with our land management? Likely we have.
Mm-hmm. And do you know why, this question is, why is there reluctance with state and federal agencies to protect beaver?
Well, I won't get into it too much, but if you're an agricultural land manager and you're growing a crop, and an area where you're growing your crop is being flooded out, or even worse, beaver are coming right in and removing parts of your crop actively, you're going to do something about it. And the way to continue to do something about that in Oregon, as long as beavers are considered a nuisance and labeled a predator of trees, is to just go and remove them and kill them, and continually remove them and kill them if they're posing problems. Even so much as going through an entire drainage and removing them. And as long as that status stands, that will be the mode of dealing with them, and that goes for private industrial forest lands and agricultural lands. And I think there's a huge resistance to changing this nuisance and predatory status of beavers for just the protection of their livelihood in those land management practices. Again, my argument would be we all need water and we all need water going forward. And I also would argue that we need a diversity of vegetation that would just naturally add resilience. We need these oases of wetland components to interrupt fire patterns, to increase our water availability, to attenuate floods, and to improve water quality. So I think until we have a big enough cultural shift in that mindset of controlling these dynamic systems, because once you allow beavers to stay or get established in an area, you relinquish some control, and and people have to be okay with that, and the trade-offs of that. And so.
And then, do you know, are there beavers in Beaver Creek these days?
In Beaver Creek at Ona Beach? Is that the Beaver
Yes,
Creek?
I believe so. That's what they're referring to.
Yes, there are a lot of Nutria, but if you know what you're looking for, you can pick out the beavers and
oh.
But the Nutria are who you see if you are lazy about getting out there in the morning. The beavers are who you see if you're there right even at dark first light, or in the evenings at dusk, or just before it's getting dark. Yeah, I've seen not as many as I had seen maybe 7 or 8 years ago for whatever reason, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But, and the last couple of times I've paddled in there, the Nutria were out in full force. So there's definitely a pretty strong population of Nutria in there.
I see them there every time I go.
Yeah.
The Nutria. All right, and then this question is, what other agencies or nonprofits are interested in beaver research on the Oregon coast? My background is working with endangered bird species in the forest and on the coast. Beavers are great engineers, and it looks like their work can benefit various species within the watershed ecosystem. And then it says your talk was very informative. And real quick before I turn it over to you for this, I wanted to point out too here that we have Paul Engelmeyer also joining us on this call, and he just wanted me to mention to make sure that folks knew that the Mid-Coast Watershed Council can also work with any private landowners to learn how to work with beavers and live with beavers as well. And do you know of any others, or what would you recommend for that?
Sure. Boy, there's quite a force. So the Beaver Coalition is a newly formed nonprofit. Rob Walton, he's retired policy analyst with NOAA Fisheries, and Jacob Shockey, who will help people. He will help landowners live with beavers, and he's fantastic. They both are, and so reaching out to them. There are all these different circles of people that are doing various things with regard to beavers, and as I showed you, the body of science is dramatically increasing, which is fantastic. I'm not sure. I would just reach out to me later. I would like to talk more about that. My contact information is here, and I can also share a bibliography of research about beavers that over 1,300 or 13,000 peer-reviewed research. I've got a bibliography I could share with folks if they want it. Bob Beshta recently put that together. There's a lot of work to do, in my opinion, and I think the benefits are just countless. So finding ways to live with them it behooves us to do that going forward. So yeah.
We're all connected somehow.
Yeah.
All right, so for somebody who would like to get into habitat restoration and species conservation, what would be your get the foot in the door job that would eventually lead to where you want to go?
Well, my avenues were, I worked for the Extension Service for Oregon State University for a while. I really liked working for the Extension Service. They had watershed program specialists back when, right before I was going back for my graduate degree. And I did really like the perception of, well, you're in touch with the science, but you can communicate very directly with the landowners. And I think our future in conservation and restoration is really dependent on private lands. The Saisal National Forest is trying to reach all lands through our stewardship programs, where we use retained receipts from our thinning to implement projects that would have a direct benefit to national forest on all lands within a watershed. And the truth of the matter is the main critical habitat is the low gradient stream systems. And the Forest Service doesn't often own, and certainly doesn't often own these tidal systems. So wherever you could better educate and influence the private land management practices and get your foot in the door. I don't know that I have, just a perfect answer, but I would say, wherever we can move into more of these low gradient systems, the return on the investment will be, far greater than even some of the treatments that we've been trying since really the Northwest Forest Plan was implemented in '94 on the SICE law on the federal land ownership. And that's primarily because we're stuck working in these transport reaches with these pockets of low gradient habitat. And the real critical habitat is that very low gradient valley bottom. So we don't often have, the kind of access to those areas, and they're very altered. Many of them are very, they're ditched and diked and changed, and the restoration action could be, the benefits could be huge.
And I might also throw in there, volunteer, or like find organizations like Mid-Coast Watershed or other watershed councils, and start volunteering and seeing what their projects are and meeting people that way, and they know people. So that's always a good way to kind of just start learning about it and learning who and what everybody does. Because once you start learning about it, there's always so much more than you ever think.
Yeah,
At least
yeah,
is what I've
volunteering
found.
for sure is the way in the door. And if, for instance, if you're really interested in salmon and salmon habitat and maybe the connections of the habitats, then focusing on someone like, Trout Unlimited, or trying to get in with the salmon superhighway type projects, which have been implemented primarily, to this point, more on the North Coast. Or if you're, if you're really truly more interested in some of these tidal features, this area, the Salmon River estuary area, and the coastal headland has a marine reserve. It has a biosphere reserve. There's a lot of places where some volunteer work could take you in a number of different directions. Depending on if you're more interested in the protections that are in place, or the restoration work itself, or the ongoing plantings, or the monitoring, where we have these ongoing vegetation transects that need revisited. There's assessments about the elevations out here and through time. And this is just this estuary piece, and the headland is a huge resource. There's not another place quite like it. So, and there's still a lot more that we could be gleaning from it if we had people to help us. And I think certainly volunteering to help in any number of places within a project like this area, or even 5 Mile Bell, or with some of the other restoration work that the site is doing. We're short staffed, and we're really limited in our aquatic program right now, and I'm definitely feeling it. I think that's why my hesitation. But when we do get to hire seasonals and we bring folks on, I mean, that's a wonderful foot in the door for the kind of work that I've been talking about today. So
it takes a village.
Yeah, it really does.
All right, what is the effect of Nutria on the waterways?
I hate Nutria. They're just they dig into the banks. Probably there's some habitat generation with some of that, some of the digging into the banks and the porosity, or some of the little holes where young fish could get into, because beavers that bank den certainly do that too. I don't know what to say in particular about Nutria, just that they don't have a natural predator, and they're invasive, and they're not from here. So, and they don't build dams, and they don't provide benefits that go along with, say, beavers. And there is a contentious relationship between Nutria and some of the other small mammals that would move into an area where you would have beavers. Some of our native mammals, mink, and some of the other, otter, and it's just kind of a contentious relationship. So I don't know exactly what it does from a biology standpoint in terms of competition with other animals. But I know that they don't, they certainly don't provide the kind of benefits. And then often landowners who have any kind of mechanisms to route their water are super frustrated by Nutria because of the way that the holes are damage that infrastructure, and even road beds and various things, wherever they're digging their dens. I don't know too much more than that.
And then this will be the last question, and I'm going to kind of combine two different ones. This one is, and I think you may have addressed this in an earlier question, but I'm not sure. Can you tell me if beaver deceiver structures have been successful? And then maybe a little bit potentially on information about beavers and water quality to wrap it.
Okay. So yeah, beaver deceivers are successful, and there's a number of ways that you can use them. You can run pipes, through a culvert and under a dam that a beaver maybe have created close to the culvert, and keep water levels of the dam system in check. Keep kind of cap that elevation that the beavers tend to get greedy. And so they will just go taller and more expansive with their dams if given the opportunity. But the deceivers help with that and can help cap that expanse of the ponds behind the dams. There's also mechanisms that can be built around the inlet of culverts to just prevent the beaver from building right on the culvert itself, and those work well. The deceivers, I think of them more as pond elevation caps, because they're essentially a drainage that is caged that the beaver can't get to, and so it's set at an elevation that will prevent the flooding from increasing above that elevation, and the beaver can't manipulate that. They're very attracted to running water, so they'll move into areas where they're hearing running water and try to plug the hole, but they're prevented from doing that in these cases. So so it can be a win-win. They have enough water to keep from getting caught by predators, cougars in particular, or they're susceptible, but they don't have too much water that they're flooding, your orchard or your house or the road or. Oh, and the other question was?
Around beavers and water quality.
Okay. There's a really good study that came out of North Devon, England, and I can get that to you. Maybe I'll get that to you, Tara, and it can be shared. Same with that bibliography of research.
Okay.
And it has some great before and after data and water quality data downstream, where there's a farm and then an enclosure, a fenced area, where they introduced to a beaver pair, a mating pair. And then over time, the beaver dams were constructed by the beavers in this enclosure, and the water quality coming into the dam complex off of the farm was collected. The water transferred down through these sequence of ponds, I think about 13 beaver dams and ponds. And then the water quality was assessed at the outflow below all of these beaver dams. And that study has some really nice results on temperature, nitrates and phosphates and various things that might have been coming off in either fertilizer or agricultural chemicals that were picked up as it left this agricultural land, but then weren't picked up as it left this complex of beaver ponds. And so I'm happy to share that. It's a really great study. So
yeah,
and reintroducing beaver to England is very controversial. As probably many of you guys know, they were killed out of England completely during the early fur trade. And they still really don't have beavers, but they've been taking beavers from another similar species out of Scotland, and they've been allowed to reintroduce beavers into England from there, but they have to do it in these fenced enclosures. So beavers, they're not just free to roam or be. They're forced into these enclosures, and then what they do over time is measured and assessed. And so that's what some of these studies have produced.
Yeah, if you want to get me that study, I'd be happy to plug in a link to it when I post the replay in the description on our YouTube
Right.
and our blog as well. So, and that was it. That's our last question. Just have a couple more comments here that say excellent information. Thank you. Really appreciate you being here, Cami. Thank you to everybody who joined us this morning. And I will be posting this by Tuesday morning to our YouTube channel and our website. And you will get an email with those links if you are registered for this presentation. And with that, I wish you all a good weekend.
Great. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye. Thanks again, Cami. Yeah, bye-bye.